I go to a church where everybody is accepted, everybody is welcome, and you could be anyone, but we'll always be nice to you and accept you.
Well, hello friends. Let me tell you a little bit about our story on this historic occasion. It actually has three parts. It begins when Unitarian missionaries, and you heard that right, missionaries began to move up from California into the Pacific Northwest in the early 1870s. And the fellow who made it to Seattle didn't stay very long because it was a pretty rough place at that time. But Seattle was a boomtown and was growing rapidly, and by 15 years later, there were enough New Englanders in town to start a Unitarian church. And they did. The first Unitarian church downtown, the building used to stand where the convention center now stands. In 1909, the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exhibition was held on the grounds where the present University of Washington now stands. And in its exhibition time, there were more than 4 million visitors. Population in the city of Seattle began to move north, and right at that time, there were enough Unitarians in what we call the University District to create their own church. And this is the beginning of University Unitarian Church. The first thing they did was create a chapter of the women's organization. And secondly, those mothers decided that they wanted to have a Sunday school in the University District for their own kids, so they didn't have to ride the trolley downtown on Sundays. So they created their own Sunday school, and what followed from that was, why don't we have our own building? Why don't we call our own minister? They met first in the Adventist Church in the University District, and in January 1913 founded University Unitarian Church. The minister in Portland, Maine, John Carroll Perkins, answered the call and came with his wife in 1914 to be our first minister. But no sooner did they call him that they decided to build their own building and found a lot at the corner of 16th and 47th, now behind University Presbyterian Church, engaged Ellsworth Story, a famous local architect, to design their little Tudor chapel, which was groundbreaking in 1915 and dedicated in 1916. The first president of the congregation was Edwin A. Start, who was recruited actually from the East to be the first head of the University Extension Program. And so he came and served as president for 10 years. And between those two persons, Dr. Perkins and Professor Start, they had ample leadership in the first difficult period of our history. Many ministers served us in this first period. I want to just hold up one, Dorothy Dyer, who came in 1927. She was the first woman minister, we called, at a time when there were very few women ministers. She was only 31 years old when she came to us, and this was her first church. The main thing about Dorothy Dyer is that she was the first of our ministers to extend herself to the students at the University of Washington and to make a connection with the student body and our congregation. So the second phase of our history begins in 1942, actually, with the calling of Josiah Bartlett as our minister. Joe was only 29 years old, and this began a renaissance at University Unitarian Church. His focus was on youth, and his emphasis in all of his ministry was on a practical approach to religion and fellowship. Joe was also the first minister to really engage the congregation in community affairs and activities. Some of these things came to his door, other things he helped initiate. In 1947, Albert Canwell, who was the state representative from Spokane, began his communist witch hunting in the state legislature and the University of Washington, and created quite a nuisance of himself and misery for many people here. There was a rule at the university that no faculty or students could discuss this on the grounds of the campus. And so they looked for a place outside in which to meet and to discuss strategy to combat Canwell. And University Unitarian Church was the only place that made space available to them. Joe and 3 other Unitarians were among the 7 founders of the Washington Committee on Academic Freedom, which was the group that fought Canwell really to his end. Aaron Gilmartin followed him. The church continued to grow. Aaron was very involved in the community activities in Seattle. And what we begin to see actually in the worship life of the church in this period is a switch to a more humanistic focus in its worship life. Gil was always involved in social justice activities. He created the first statewide chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. He worked with the Nisqually Indians on their reservation. He was involved in housing desegregation at a time when that was quite unusual, actually. A number of African American families were attracted to the church, who played important leadership roles over the years to come. The membership was growing every year, more and more children in the church school, and it became obvious almost by the end of his first year that we had to do something about our building and our location. And in 1955, this site on which we now have our building was discovered, and in 1958, the ground was broken for the new building. Paul Hayden Kirk had been selected as the architect, famous locally and then later internationally as a champion of the Northwest style, modernist style in architecture. And in 1959, this building was dedicated. It was dedicated in the fall, and Gil left to go to California in March. Momentous things had happened during his ministry, and I think we could fairly say that his thumbprints are still found all over who we are and what we do. A search committee was put together to find the next minister, and they found the Reverend Peter Rabel, who was in Lincoln, Nebraska, and invited him back, which greatly pleased his wife, who had actually grown up in this congregation, and her parents were very active lay people here.
What often people don't know is this church was my mother's church as well, before my father probably even knew that there was a Unitarian church in Seattle. And my grandparents came here in the mid-40s. And so there's that whole legacy, but it wasn't even any of that caused me to become a member. Why I became a member was that one of the congregants here invited me to service.
The church entered another period of rapid growth after the new building was completed and the programs were beginning to be implemented. It was these were heady days for liberals in the United States, the early 1960s and all through the 60s. Peter continued that tradition of both deep denominational involvement and social justice activities, in addition to dealing with a growing congregation, being the only minister on site. And by the mid-60s, we had 5 services during the week, and our church school grew. At this time, at its height, was 880 children.
And Peter just took off. He was a very direct speaker. I mean, he wasn't afraid of anything, and he took this whole congregation, and it grew as a result of it because people really were interested in what this man had to say.
Hearing Peter Rabel speak about abortion and abortion rights was pretty risque and astounding and courageous.
Well, it also led, of course, to, I think it was an initiative in the state which made Washington State the first and only state in the country to have legal and safe abortions.
Peter was way out in front of issues long before they became popular. So while some of those things happened in the 70s and 80s, Peter in the 1960s was talking about abortion, homosexuality, euthanasia, suicide, pointing to things that were going to be very significant for the common good, and helping to inspire and rally members to mobilize and to take action on a number of those things. Beginning in the early 60s, the Seattle chapter of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, continuing our commitment to racial equality, actually pioneers in the Seattle area, some of our members for that cause. Other civil rights issues, protesting the Vietnam War, women's liberation, which radically changed Unitarian Universalism, larger numbers of women entering our ministry.
I was at a transition point in my life. My mother had just died, and I had watched her go through a very painful, miserable death. I joined the Hemlock Society. As a result, it led to more intense involvement. And I was prepared to go to jail over it. I was feeling if it comes to that, so be it. Our group worked on a case and brought it before the Supreme Court, and it became a law. I feel very, very happy about my involvement in helping that to happen.
I think the place where I really felt energy for the first time was getting involved in DeWolf House and in the mid-'80s, and the opportunity to do something really tangible for housing people who were ill with AIDS, and being able to do something very concrete about that. I thought I was just going over there to pull weeds, and that seemed, simple and well, basically at a skill level I could handle. But getting drawn into their lives, we went to memorial services on a regular basis. I could have gone to a memorial service every week. But they wanted to share their histories and some of the ways their families were broken, and I was willing to be there to listen. And they also invited me to have a glass of wine with them, and we got to know each other. So that was a surprise. That wasn't what I expected.
Soon after joining the church, I became aware that there was a committee that was an offshoot of the Social Justice Committee that was studying the issue of the wars in Central America and the displacement of particularly Salvadorans and Guatemalans. The people who were on the caravan, unshowered, got out of the vehicles, came into the church where this congregation or this sanctuary was full of people waiting, and the people who were on the caravan came in through the sanctuary doors and up to the front of the sanctuary where the public testimony began in this place. It was just very, very moving. I remember one particular testimony in particular where Armando, a man who was going to stay at University Baptist Church, who had been very quiet on the trip, came to the front and said, "I only have few words to say, and they are thank you, thank you, thank you." So it was a very, very moving service that we had here to conclude that caravan.
I think there were several upsetting periods during that time when we were worried about the non-citizen status of the refugees and afraid we were going to be arrested for illegally importing them, or more seriously, afraid that they were going to be arrested and deported.
So I think we can feel proud about some of these many accomplishments, and I know I haven't included all of them that we can claim as a part of our history and our legacy. In 1997, Peter retired after nearly 40 years of ministry in this congregation, and a very great era in the life of this church had come to an end.